They bought her for $15 at the Montgomery slave auction in March of 1856. A 70-year-old black woman with bent shoulders, scarred hands and eyes most bidders refused to meet. The auctioneer called her worn out, past usefulness, a burden rather than a bargain. Men laughed as the price dropped. $50, $40, $20, finally $15. The cost of a broken mule or a damaged plow. Thomas Thornton raised his hand, not because he needed her, but because he assumed she would die quietly within a year. What he could not see was that he had just purchased the end of his bloodline. Within 2 years, his son would be dead, then his wife, then Thomas himself, followed by his heir. 4 deaths, 4 funerals, no charges, no suspicions. Doctors blamed sickness, stress, weak hearts, bad nerves. Preachers said the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Neighbors whispered that Thornfield plantation was cursed. The only constant presence through every illness, every decline, every final breath was the old woman from the auction block, known to everyone as Mama Yaya, the healer with the gentle voice and the miraculous teas. She cured fevers, eased pain, calmed troubled minds, and saved lives across the county. Planters trusted her. Doctors deferred to her. Families thanked God for her hands. What no one questioned was what else those hands could do. What they didn't know was that Mama Yaya carried knowledge older than America itself. Knowledge of roots that heal and roots that kill, of leaves that soothe and leaves that stop the heart, of poisons that leave no mark and look exactly like nature taking its course. This is not a ghost story. This is not a legend. This is a reconstruction drawn from records, dates, and whispered histories the archives never wanted to keep. This is the true account of how the most underestimated woman in Alabama turned a garden into a weapon, patience into power, and grief into a revenge so perfect that no one ever realized a crime had been committed at all. In the spring of 1856, Alabama stood at the center of a nation feeding on human bondage. Cotton ruled the economy, and Montgomery functioned as one of the South's busiest slave markets, where men, women, and children were bought beneath courthouse steps and warehouse awnings as casually as livestock. By that year, enslaved people over 50 were considered nearly worthless. 70-year-olds were assumed to be waiting for death. Medical care was crude, doctors relied on bleeding and mercury, and plantations often depended on enslaved healers whose botanical knowledge far exceeded white medical training, even as that knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Thornfield plantation sat just outside Montgomery. 300 acres of cotton, worked by over 100 enslaved laborers, owned by Thomas Thornton, a second-generation planter, whose wealth came not from innovation, but inheritance. Thornton was 45, known locally for his temper, his drinking, and his absolute belief in the natural order of slavery. His household ran on fear, routine, and silence. Into this world came Mama Yaya, born enslaved in Virginia in 1786, before Alabama was even a state. She had survived 7 decades of forced labor, multiple sales, and the permanent loss of every child she ever bore. What she carried with her could not be catalogued at auction. A living pharmacopoeia learned from her West African grandmother, refined across 50 years of healing work on plantations from Virginia to the Deep South. Enslaved communities whispered her name with respect. Planters spoke of her as useful. Doctors tolerated her because she worked. Assigned to the big house, Mama Yaya was given control of the herb, garden, and access to everybody on the plantation, enslaved and free alike. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, this made her invisible and indispensable at the same time. No one noticed how carefully she planted certain flowers among the harmless ones, how closely she observed the family that owned her, or how patience, learned through generations of survival, had finally found a purpose. Mama Yaya was 70 years old when she arrived at Thornfield, but age had not dulled her mind. Born enslaved in Virginia in 1786, she had been raised by a grandmother taken from West Africa, a woman marked with tribal scars and armed with deep, botanical knowledge that slavery could not erase. From childhood, Yaya learned which roots closed wounds, which leaves cooled fevers, which seeds stopped pregnancy, and which plants ended life without leaving a mark. Sold south at 12, bred, worked, and broken by decades of forced labor. She outlived her owners, her children, and nearly everyone she had ever loved. Survival taught her silence, usefulness, and observation. Thomas Thornton, her owner, was 45, thick-bodied, quick to anger, and convinced that authority was his birthright. He drank heavily, ruled through fear, and believed enslaved people were tools meant to wear out. His wife, Margaret, 35, was pale, anxious, and perpetually unwell. Her migraines a constant presence in the household. She survived by shrinking herself, never contradicting her husband, never challenging his cruelty. Their eldest son, Robert, 22, was weak-willed and indulgent, already sliding into drink and irresponsibility, groomed to inherit a system he barely understood. Caroline, 19, carried beauty without warmth, already resigned to a future arranged by others, emotionally detached as a means of survival. Daniel, 17, was the most dangerous of all, impulsive, cruel, and eager to assert power through violence. His temper a mirror of his father's without restraint. The youngest, Emma, 8 years old, watched quietly from the margins, not yet hardened, her eyes lingering too long on the enslaved people the others ignored. And then there was Jesse, 16, strong, gentle, and steady, working in the stables. He was Mama Yaya's grandson, the last living trace of her stolen family, and the reason this story would not end the way anyone expected. For 6 months after her arrival, nothing at Thornfield seemed out of the ordinary. Mama Yaya worked quietly, tending the herb garden behind the kitchen house, mixing teas, poultices, and tonics that eased pain and mended bodies. Her remedies worked. Margaret's migraines eased. Thomas's gout subsided. Infections healed. Fevers broke. Word spread quickly that the old healer was a blessing, and with each success, trust deepened. She was summoned at all hours, allowed into bedrooms, sick rooms, and studies, given access no enslaved person should have had. What they didn't know was that she was learning them as carefully as they were learning to trust her. She noted Daniel's temper, Robert's weakness, Margaret's fragile heart, Thomas's dependence on whiskey, the rhythm of the household, the patterns of illness and indulgence. The turning point came in October of 1856, during the cotton harvest, when Jesse was pulled from the stables and sent to the gin house, a place of noise, dust, and sharp iron teeth. Exhausted and overworked, he stumbled, spilling cotton across the floor. Daniel saw it and exploded. He struck Jesse with a wooden handle again and again, ignoring shouts to stop. When the final blow cracked Jesse's skull, work resumed as if nothing had happened. Thomas dismissed it as an accident, a boy who lost his temper. Jesse lingered for 3 days, slipping in and out of consciousness as Mama Yaya worked desperately to save him. When he died before dawn, something in her hardened permanently. She returned to work after 3 days, obedient, silent, and smiling. What they didn't know was that grief had finished teaching her its final lesson. Survival was no longer enough. Patience, knowledge, and access were now aligned, and justice, denied by law, had found another path. The truth, uncovered only when the pattern is laid bare, is that the deaths at Thornfield were never random, never the work of fate or sickness or God's will. They were deliberate, measured, and invisible. Mama Yaya did not strike in rage. She did not lash out. She waited. She let grief settle into something colder and more precise. She understood what no one else did. On a plantation, illness was expected, decline was normal, and death was routine. All she had to do was guide bodies toward outcomes doctors already believed in. Daniel was the first. Not sudden, not dramatic, but a slow unraveling that looked like the consequences of excess and youth gone wrong. His pain grew, his strength faded, and when he finally died in early 1857, no one questioned it. What they didn't know was that every cup meant to soothe him was part of a quiet design. Margaret followed, her long-standing weakness becoming something fatal over time, her failing heart attributed to grief and stress. Thomas deteriorated next, his shaking hands and seizures blamed on drink and age, his authority collapsing alongside his health. By the time he died in 1858, neighbors openly whispered that the family was cursed. Robert never saw it coming. His mind fractured under pressure, loss and fear, and when he ended his own life, the explanation wrote itself. 4 deaths, 4 different causes, one constant presence. The healer was always there, always trusted, always trying to help. No doctor ever suspected her. No record accused her. The truth is that Mama Yaya used nothing foreign to the world she lived in. She used time, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations that slavery tried and failed to erase. What looked like mercy was method. What looked like care was control. And by the time anyone might have questioned it, there was no one left to accuse her. By the summer of 1858, Thornfield plantation was already collapsing under the weight of its dead. 4 graves stood side by side in the family cemetery, each marked with marble, each representing a loss neighbors could not explain. Thomas Thornton's authority had vanished with him, leaving behind debt, mismanagement, and fear. Enslaved people fled whenever they could, sensing weakness and chaos. Overseers ruled harshly to compensate, accelerating the plantation's decline. Crops failed, credit dried up, and merchants in Montgomery began refusing Thornton accounts. The house itself fell silent, its once-ordered routines replaced by whispers and shuttered rooms. Robert's death sealed the family's reputation. Suicide, especially under such circumstances, fed superstition. Churchgoers murmured about divine punishment. Visitors stayed away. The plantation's name became something spoken only in lowered voices. Caroline, now barely 21, inherited what was left, a decaying estate, an enslaved population she could not control, and a younger sister who woke screaming from nightmares. With no viable suitors and no capital, she made the only choice left. She arranged to leave Alabama, sending word to relatives in Mobile and preparing to sell the land. Buyers were scarce. The Thornton name carried too much shadow. When the plantation finally sold at auction in 1859, it fetched a fraction of its former value, and the enslaved people were sold in lots, families broken apart yet again. Mama Yaya was sold once more, this time for $5, to a small farmer near Selma. She left Thornfield without ceremony, without suspicion, carrying nothing but her knowledge and her silence. Within 4 years, the plantation stood empty. During the war it burned, its columns collapsing into ash and rumor. Nothing remained but foundations and stories, and the belief that some crimes, once committed, do not disappear. They rot quietly, spreading outward, until the structure that allowed them finally collapses. Mama Yaya did not leave behind letters, confessions, or monuments. She left no record of what she had done, because the world she lived in would never have listened. She died quietly in 1860 on a small farm near Selma, listed in a ledger as an old enslaved woman who tended a garden. No mention of the family she outlived, no accounting for the lives taken or the justice claimed. Thornfield, the plantation that once stood as a symbol of wealth and power, vanished within a generation. Its land sold, its name whispered, its ruins erased by time and war. History recorded the Thorntons as victims of misfortune, illness, and tragedy. It recorded Mama Yaya as property. But the truth lives in the spaces between official records, in patterns that only become visible when silence is broken. Her story forces an uncomfortable question about justice in a world where law protected cruelty and punished survival. When courts refuse to see a crime, when power makes violence invisible, what form can justice take? Mama Yaya chose patience over spectacle, knowledge over force, and invisibility over martyrdom. She did not free herself, but she reclaimed something slavery tried to strip away: agency. Whether her actions were justice or murder is not a question history can answer easily, and perhaps it should not. What matters is that her story reminds us that resistance did not always look like chains breaking or battles fought. Sometimes it looked like an old woman stirring a pot in a kitchen, trusted by those who never imagined she could threaten them. If this story unsettled you, it should. These histories are not meant to comfort. Share your thoughts below. Was this justice or vengeance? Where do you draw the line? And what state are you watching from? If you want more untold stories pulled from the darkest corners of American history, subscribe now and stay with us. There are many more truths still buried.